Hey, what's going on guys? Ben Brewster here, Tread Athletics. Highly requested video breakdown of Chase Burns. First part here is we're going to be breaking down his mechanics and really answering the question, how does he throw so hard? How does he sit 98 plus as a starter in college with 20 plus inches of vertical break? Right? That's something that no one in the big leagues currently is doing with those numbers and averaging that as a starter. So how does he move? How does he move so efficiently? And then his arsenal, some of the data, some of the metrics behind what he's doing. And then also compare him to what has he changed from Tennessee? What has he changed over the last couple of years? And how does that compare to some of the other big leaguers that have very similar arsenals and similar profiles? And what can we expect from him throughout the upcoming pro career? So getting into his mechanics, again, 6'3", 210, very good athlete. You can tell he's very explosive. General overview of his arsenal, averaging a touch above 98, up to 100 plus miles an hour pretty regularly. I believe he was up to 102 last year. Slider in the upper 80s with almost 9 inches of sweep, power curveball in the low 80s, and then a changeup as well. Interesting fact about Chase, so I actually had the opportunity to assess him about 5 years ago, worked with him for about a month. And so at that point, obviously physically wasn't as mature. He was 6'2", 182 pounds. You can see from a strength standpoint, really hadn't developed a strength base. And so for us, it was just putting him through a movement screen, putting him through our assessment and just kind of giving him some guidance as far as next steps and what we were seeing from that standpoint. But obviously we don't work with him at this point in time. He's been with Tennessee, he's been with Wake Forest, he's developed quite the athleticism and strength base from that point. So I can't speak to exactly what his strength metrics are right now. I have heard from some of our contacts that his vertical jump is one of the top, if not the top on the team, so very athletic, but I don't have specifics on his lifting metrics right now. But again, I knew it at 16 years old, seeing a kid who barely had a strength base, touching 88 miles an hour, knew this kid could be throwing hard one day. And it's just awesome to see this kind of coming to fruition and him being projected in the top half, if not the top 5 overall picks in the upcoming draft. So from just a big picture perspective, what do we look for when evaluating mechanics from the standpoint of generating elite stuff, generating maximum velocity? From a big picture standpoint, what are we trying to accomplish? We're trying to be able to convert linear momentum into rotation. So that's really the crux of the matter when it comes to high level throwing mechanics, is blending and converting linear into rotational. And so that's really the framework that we'll use to break down his mechanics. Is the linear, is that initial forward move, right? Kind of phase 1 of the lower half is that forward move, that drift, initiating the center of mass out away from the rubber. Phase 2 of a high level lower half is drop, or the hinge phase, right? That's the linear phase towards the target. That's this move right here. Drift, linear move. Right, so he's created a ton of linear momentum at this point. Phase 3 of a high level lower half is rotation. That's taking this pelvis that's stayed stacked and sideways down the slope, and at the last second, late, well timed, popping the hips open, popping the pelvis open into landing while keeping the upper half closed. So that's the rotation. That's the third phase of an effective lower half. We've converted at this point that linear into rotation. And so that's the key move that converts that linear move into usable rotation. Phase 4 of an effective lower half is the block. And so that's making sure that front foot gets down, stabilizes, the knee stabilizes, and now you have something to actually rotate and be able to decelerate the pelvis into. So his lead leg block, again, we'll go through each of these kind of piece by piece, but those are the 4 phases. And then from here, it's really just about sending that energy up the chain sequentially. Pelvis first, then torso, then out and around into the arm, making sure that upper arm and making sure the ball is able to sink into that plane of rotation of the shoulder. So you're sending that tornado of energy up the spine, up the hips, up the spine, out and around into the arm, and then ultimately trying to maximize how much of that energy, how much of the momentum makes its way into the ball. And so whether you're looking at sidearm pitcher, over the top pitcher, submarine pitcher, like any pitcher, you can kind of assess their mechanics and how they're moving through that framework. How well do they convert that linear momentum into rotational momentum? How well do they send that energy up the chain and turn their pelvis, their spine, and their arm into a whip? How well do they sequence that entire process? And that's what's referred to by biomechanists as the kinematic sequence. You want to see the order of operations in that proper sequence. You want to see the pelvis rotate ahead of the torso, rotate ahead of the arm. So let's backtrack now that we have a big picture overview of how the delivery works and break down each of these pieces. So Chase Burns in particular has a very aggressive first move, a very aggressive drift. And so from the side view, you can see he really gets a lean into the target and a little bit back towards first base as well. And so he's gaining ground with his center of mass towards the target at this point. Now what this does is now, because he's actually shifted his center of mass out and away from the rubber, he's not going to get stuck over the rubber in a balance point. He's initiated this aggressive shift of his center of mass. And so now what he can do is he can just drop straight down at this point. And because he's already shifted away 4, 5, 6 inches away from the rubber, he can think about dropping straight down instead of having to push himself out. The resulting force vector is going to be a lateral force vector. So he shifted away, he's dropping down, the resulting vector allows him to get lateral into his backside. And so you see he's just dropping down and he's maintaining a relative stack of the pelvis and of the torso. So this relationship between the head, the trunk, the pelvis is relatively stacked. He's not tipping way uphill. He's not leaning way back towards first base. He's not already dumping and rushing and leading with his head towards the target. So he's in a relative athletic stacked position here where that spine is in a relatively neutral position and trying to hold that position as long as he can down the slope. One point that one of our contacts with Wake did mention is that something that he's worked on in the past this year is actually making sure that as he gets to that point at peak leg lift, you can see he's in a relatively high posture. He's leaning slightly back towards first base. But one of the things he focuses on is on not getting stuck too far back into the heel. So not leaning so far back that his weight starts to drift and shift way back towards first base. When that happens with guys, when that center of mass isn't firmly through that entire back foot, when it shifts way too far towards the heel, then it actually changes the stride direction. And so guys, in a lot of cases, what I've seen is when that happens, guys' stride direction ends up open. All their direction ends up going through, in this case, the left-handed batter's box, and that can lead to yank and missing low and glove side. And so from what I've heard, that is something that he's been actively focusing on, is making sure that as he gets to that peak leg lift, it's not excessively leaning back, it's keeping the ribs down, keeping that stacked relationship, and finding more of the midfoot or the toe instead of letting himself fall back towards first base and solely be in the heel at that point. So I think that makes a lot of sense given the tendencies that he's showing here with that higher posture. As he drops into the lower half, again, you'll notice he kicks out that lead leg. So what exactly is going on here? Now, I don't think he's actually focusing on consciously kicking the lead leg out. What this typically is, and tons of big leaguers do this, it's a natural counterbalance to the upper half, to the trunk. And so he's holding this much more upright trunk position, and we'll get into in a moment why he's doing this, maybe how that's changed from previous years. But kicking this leg straight out, this now acts as a counterbalance, which allows him to create and hold a little bit more upright trunk position here. So that lead leg acts as a counterbalance. You'll see he's holding it for really that entire linear move as he rides his lower half down the slope. We get to the unload phase, and you'll see during this whole time, if we look at his belt buckle, you can see his belt buckle is facing third base. So he has a little bit of coil, not a ton of coil, but a little bit of coil. Belt buckle is facing third base, third base, third base, third base, third base. Now it starts to open up. So a couple of frames before landing, at the very last second, he pops the hips open. So he's building tension, he's building tension, he's building tension. He's staying sideways, staying closed, stacked, closed, stacked, closed, stacked. Last second, pops the hips open, trunk stays back. And so in that instant, now he's created an insane amount of hip-shoulder separation. So the hips are popping open. He's getting to some degree of pelvic rotation. Again, I don't have his biomechanics report, but call it 30, 40, 50 degrees of rotation. So he's clearing the hips to some extent while the trunk stays back. So he's creating this insane stretch through that entire fascial sling. So from that lead adductor up through the obliques, up through the arm side pec, the lat, this entire fascial chain is put on stretch as a result of that timing and that sequencing. Again, holding tension, holding the stacked relationship, holding tension in the back hip, holding it, holding it, holding it, holding it, holding it, popping the hips open while keeping the trunk back. That's what creates that instant and that moment right here, which creates that stretch shortening cycle, that stretch reflex, and really being able to access all the elastic components and capabilities of this fascial sling, from the adductor through the throwing arm. So it's creating that insane stretch right here. One kind of piece to realize from the back view is you can see just the extent of how much extension he's able to get into. This is I mean, I can maybe think of a couple guys who get into this degree of thoracic extension at landing into their unload. Tim Lincecum comes to mind as somebody with the mobility to pull this off. There aren't many guys who are able to clear to this type of arm slot and do so without quote unquote cheating the elbow up and out of plane. And so one of the reasons it's so rare to see guys that throw 95 plus and with this high of a release point and with this type of vertical break is that most guys get to this ultra high vertical break, this ultra high slot or fastball axis by just kind of pushing and cheating the elbow up, right? The trunk, in this case, his trunk is delivering the ball. He's actually able to keep that arm in plane and get to this very extreme trunk tilt position, as opposed to keeping the trunk in a more level position and just cheating the elbow up, cheating the hand up, cheating the arm slot up to get to that point. So he's actually delivering the ball properly, using the torso, using the trunk to generate that velocity while keeping the arm actually in plane. So you see his arm unfurls in that plane of trunk rotation. Right, draw a line from shoulder to shoulder, to the elbow, to the ball. Again, we know the goal is to convert linear into rotational. If you can get that ball, you can get that upper arm into the plane of rotation of the torso, that's going to maximize usable ball velocity. With guys that are this high of a slot, another common tendency is early extension, meaning leaning backwards too early. So you look at his upper body, notice how as the pelvis begins to go, the pelvis is actually what initiates and unloads the upper half. But what a lot of younger pitchers do that try to get to this high slot is they just start leaning backwards. They start leaning backwards in this position right here and initiate rotation from the upper half. When in reality, you want to wait until the hips begin to open, and those hips are what ultimately drive extension through the upper half. So it's actually trying to keep the ribs down, keep that stacked position as long as possible, and then as the hips go, the hips now unwind that tornado of energy up the chain and unwind him into that position of extension. So the pelvis is actually driving that extension further up the chain, as opposed to cheating to create that extension from the upper half. If we look at the arm action, he's also a guy who has a little bit of an elevated glove side. Now this is something that can help certain guys generate a little bit of a higher axis on their four seam. And so I'm curious if that's something that he actively worked on, or if that just naturally happened as they kind of played with his posture, keeping him more upright. But he's definitely reaching a little bit high elevated glove side. And again, that's something that you'll often see. I can actually think back to Daniel Bard mentioned this on the podcast that I did with him, is that when he's trying to get a fastball to carry a little bit more, he actually will play with that. He'll play with kind of like the Kenley Jansen elevated glove side. And for him, he's noticed that specifically gives him a little bit more lift, a little bit more carry on those four seams. So the glove side, worth noting. How well does he capture the momentum of the handbrake, the momentum of the arm swing? You'll see he does a great job of doing that. If we look at from handbrake into the flip up position, it's a smooth pendulum. He's capturing that momentum of the arm swing. And at landing, his arm is up and on time. And you can see it very clearly on this side angle. From the back angle, it actually ends up looking like his arm's early, right? It looks like he's already in early external rotation. But if we actually look at the angle of his spine, his arm is actually right on time. It just looks like he's early because he's in such extreme extension at the spine. But I would argue this is actually a perfectly on-time arm. He just looks a little bit odd because he's in such an extreme upright posture in that relatively extended position. As he begins to rotate, you can see the pelvis is out front of the trunk and the trunk is out front of the arm. The arm lags behind for just a split second, which is what you want. That creates a stretch shortening cycle and this big pull and this elastic mechanism through the internal rotators of the shoulder. So through the pec, through the lat, through the subscap. And so he's getting this big pull through this arm because that arm is left behind, because he didn't muscle up and bring the arm into the throw too soon. And so you can tell as the arm now pulls through, closes that gap and whips into ball release in plane, he's hitting that peak layback behind the ear, behind the nose, as opposed to that arm pushing out in front of his face. So you'll see in certain guys, they have that dart throwing pattern, which is a complete velocity killer. And you'll see from a side view at peak layback, that elbow is way out in front of their face. Again, what you want for peak velocity is you want the hips to go first, slight lag, then the trunk goes, slight lag, and then the arm is slingshotted through, pulled from behind the body. And that's this insane scap retraction and hip shoulder separation that he's got. Again, we already alluded to the difficulties in creating a high slot. Most pitchers that throw from such a high slot produce this slot from cheating the elbow up out of plane. They end up getting into that darty, pushy throwing pattern. A lot of times from throwing ultra heavy balls, from throwing 2-4 pound balls, improperly done pivot pickoffs, wrist weights. There's a number of different training modalities that can lead to that kind of like elbow climbing pattern on top of just chasing vertical break. So trying to just see at any cost 20 inches of vertical break on a Rapsodo, on a TrackMan reading can lead to that compensation over time. But to his credit, to Wake Forest staff's credit, he's gotten to this point from where he was last year, and he's done it the right way. He's done it from without cheating to get to that point. He's done it from delivering his arm, from actually clearing the way, staying in plane, and using his torso to deliver the arm. But again, that's why there's so few pitchers who throw 97 plus or 95 plus even, who also have that type of outlier vertical break. So my opinion, thoracic extension is his superpower. That's one of these mobility aspects where you can really see he shines. He's got a ton of thoracic extension and he's able to pull it off as a direct result. You can really see it from this back view right here, the positions he's able to create. And then finally, one last thing I want to mention in this part of the video is back leg extension. So you can see he actually does get a little extended off the back leg into release and even at landing a little bit. So this is something where in a perfect world, you wouldn't necessarily want to see this. However, you do see this with a lot of pitchers who have very high level deliveries, but who have very elaborate drifts. So again, we go back, he's a guy with a huge drift. And so this reminds me of Tim Lincecum, Shane McClanahan, and a number of other guys who, because they're creating such early momentum down the mound, it really can pull the back leg into relative extension. So again, you could pinpoint this and say, okay, he's not getting that back foot turned over, the back hip through fully, and a little bit extended at landing. This is why that back foot is being pulled off the ground at ball release, as opposed to somebody like Jacob DeGrom, where that back foot stays stationary and turns over as that rotation is a little bit more efficiently delivered up the chain. But again, I think this is such a small, nitpicky thing that so many all-star Hall of Fame caliber pitchers have also done that to me, this isn't really a red flag, but it's just something worth noting. He does get a little bit extended on that back leg. All right, guys, let's talk about some of the year-to-year changes. We're going to talk about his arsenal, and we're going to compare him to some Hall of Fame and all-star caliber pitchers to see how his stuff might stack up and where we could potentially project him in his pro career and into the future. First off, comparing him to last year, again, transferred to Wake Forest, he's made some changes. First thing that I noticed, his release height is up about 3 to 4 inches. His fastball vert is up 2 to 3 inches. His slider depth has increased by about 3 inches, while also adding about 1 mile an hour on average to the pitch. And his changeup has lost a little bit of sink and run on it, although that's not really a pitch he throws a ton. So what exactly is going on here? Because these things don't typically just happen in isolation. And it's pretty clear if we slow down this video that this is the result of a postural change. So clearly the conversation was, how do we improve our stuff? How much better could the fastball be if instead of 18 inches of vertical break at 100 miles an hour, it was 21 inches at 100 miles an hour? And so how they were able to make this change is you can see pretty much right away from peak leg lift, where's the posture? The posture was a lot more stacked over the forefoot, right, more upright posture at Tennessee, and now again significantly more leaning backwards towards first base, so more upright posture at this point. Now this first move really plays itself out throughout the entire rest of the throw, so that's the important consideration, is the positions that you set up at the beginning of the throw are going to play out in terms of how that throw unfolds at the later parts of the throw. So you can't just look at, if we forward to release, right? We can't just be like, oh my God, his arm slot is so much higher here. The question is, why is his arm slot higher? He's getting to that higher arm slot without cheating to that higher arm slot. He's actually setting his posture higher from the very start of the throw, from how he comes set and peak leg lift, and he's letting that deliver the arm. I highly doubt he's thinking about getting to a higher arm slot. What they likely realized and what they worked on is setting that higher torso posture and allowing that to play itself out through the throw. So he's setting a higher posture as he drops into his backside. Again, you can see that to continue to play out. You can see a more forward, kind of glute-driven posture at Tennessee. And again, we immediately play that over here, and he's still able to hold that more upright posture. As that gets into the unload, right here again, you can see how extreme of a difference that plays out to in the unload. And he's in a ton of extension, relatively upright position at Tennessee. And how does that deliver the arm? Obviously that's going to play out into a higher plane of rotation, it's going to play out into a higher arm slot. But again, the key point is that he's not cheating to get to that high release point, getting to that high axis to create that vertical break. That's happening from setting a higher posture, which again, I really like that as a very simple fix given the goal of trying to create more vertical break, because we see so often at the pro levels, pitchers are coached into cheating to get more vertical break, and it ends up negatively affecting other pitches. I think they made a strategic decision here where they knew, hey, it might affect your changeup negatively early on. Just as far as some of the metrics, he's lost a little bit of depth from what he had before on the changeup, but again, the slider has now added depth, and so he's become overall a more north-south pitcher with his arsenal. So I think he profiles really well against Justin Verlander's arsenal right now, Spencer Strider, and to some extent Garrett Cole, as far as how his arsenal now plays. But it's worth noting, like any of these changes, there's going to be some trade-offs you're just going to be expecting. So one of the trade-offs that was mentioned is vertical approach angle, right? He's not going to necessarily have as flat of a vertical approach angle from this higher slot, but again, that seemed to be a trade-off they were willing to make, they were willing to go after. And we'll see in a second how that actually has played out so far in the season. So we input the movement metrics, you input the velocities. Our weighted stuff plus model actually does prefer the current fastball profile and the current slider profile. So take that for what it's worth. Also, his spin rate is actually up about 200 RPM on both fastball and slider, and about 100 RPMs on his curveball, which is also interesting. So the question, is it working? Well, his fastball whiff rate has gone from 23% to 45% this year, from 59 to 72% whiff rate on his slider, and his curveball whiff rate has gone from 38% to 63%. And again, if we kind of break that down between lefties and righties, he's just obliterating right-handed hitters. To righties, his fastball whiff rate is 49%, so even higher. His slider whiff rate is comparable, 74% to lefties and 70% to right-handed hitters. So he's just particularly obliterating right-handed hitters, but he's lowered his ERA roughly in half to this point in the season from where he was in Tennessee last year. His strikeouts per 9 are also up more than 2 per 9. So it seems to be a positive change. Again, there's a lot of trade-offs, but I'm a big fan from what I've seen so far in terms of how they made this change and how he's still able to perform, if anything, execute better than he did last year with this change. So we can go to some MLB comparisons. So this is a comparison of how his arsenal compares to Spencer Strider, Justin Verlander, and again, we took prime Justin Verlander, when he was touching 102 plus miles an hour to compare here, just to keep it fair. And then Garrett Cole, again, I would argue Garrett Cole is still in his prime, but you can see fastball velocity compares favorably. Induced vertical break is actually higher than those guys. Slider velocity compares favorably, and he's actually got a little bit more sweep, a few inches more sweep to that slider than any of these guys. So comparable arsenal to arguably 2 Hall of Famers and Spencer Strider, one of the best pitchers in the game right now. So again, the sky's the limit. It's not saying he's going to get to this point necessarily. There's a lot that has to go right to get to that point. But again, his arsenal is truly top tier when you look at the profiles he's got from both a fastball and a slider standpoint. Looking at a couple things that when kind of asking like where could he improve moving forward, like let's say he does go 5th overall, what might teams be thinking, where could he improve from this point? Well, one of the things is just looking at pitch locations. And again, there's always trade-offs, but it's kind of clear from looking at his current locations that with the fastball, he's just throwing that thing over the middle, letting it move. And so there's not really a clear quadrant of the zone where he's favoring significantly more. If we compare this to somebody like Justin Verlander, you can see there's a clear tendency to throw that pitch in the top half, ideally the top third of the zone. Typically what you'd want for a pitch that already has a lot of induced vertical break, you're trying to get above the barrel, you're trying to induce swings underneath the ball. And so throwing in that top half, ultimately top third of the zone is probably more so what you'd want to see as far as that overall tendency. And I think that's an area where over time, as his command starts to get better, if he can do it without sacrificing his stuff, getting that pitch a little more towards the top half of the zone, probably something that he already knows he's trying to work on moving forward. A couple of potential concerns to be aware of. One would be if we're going to take that Justin Verlander comparison. One of the things that I talked about when I've broken down Justin Verlander is Verlander had the ability for most of his career to show 100 miles an hour, but he didn't necessarily show 100 miles an hour on every single pitch. So in this day and age, especially, I don't blame him in terms of how he's doing this, but he's taking a little bit more of like that reliever approach, that reliever mentality to being a starter. And so he's not holding anything back. He's not saving up for the 2nd inning, 3rd inning, 4th inning. He's coming right after guys, max effort, every single pitch. Every single pitch is maxed out from a stuff perspective. From a pure outcome standpoint, that's the way to go. From a how did Justin Verlander last as long as he has lasted, I think that's where the conversation starts to diverge a little bit. And I would argue one of the reasons Verlander was as durable as he was is that he found himself in this unique scenario where his stuff was so good, so dominant, that even if he kind of cruised at 90, 95%, that was still good enough to overpower hitters. and then he could always have 100 miles an hour in his back pocket whenever he wanted. And so Burns might be close to that point where his stuff is so good, he knows he can throw 101 whenever he wants. Maybe from a longevity standpoint, that does become a conscious choice. So again, something for him to consider. What does that look like? Hey, I know I could cruise easily 100 pitches, recover a lot better than if I go max effort 100 pitches. Maybe I don't quite make it as far into the season before I start to fatigue or break down. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays out over a longer time horizon. Other concerns, not just for him, but for anybody who's in this super high posture, this is somewhat more of a risk factor for younger kids, but in this type of extension, right, you can see this extreme degree of spinal extension. You will see a risk factor for low back, stress fractures, stress reactions, again, more so in younger kids, if they lose some of that thoracic extension or hip mobility. So not saying it's a concern immediately or anything like that, but for anyone watching, like if you get into these types of positions and you do have back pain, one of the things that can happen is that guys' lumbar facets will run into each other. So they don't have the range to do this with the upper back and their hips. Sometimes the low back will kind of take over and run into itself, and that's where you can get certain, low back issues in extension with extension plus rotation. So just something to be aware of, a kind of an educational tidbit for guys that are having issues who also have similarly high slots or get into, particularly early extension at the low back. And then he's had high-ish pitch counts at times this season, 108, 109 pitches. So again, I'm more thinking of it of like he has potential all-star caliber stuff. What does it look like for him to now be able to play and do this for 15 years? Approach-wise, I'm a huge fan of what I've seen from his approach on the mound. He has a bulldog mentality. He's in attack mode from pitch one. And so that's something that I think it comes down to the specific athlete and their personality and what works best for them. And so I personally find it super entertaining to watch guys that have this bulldog mentality, but that's not necessarily going to work for everybody. He's not pacing himself. He's trying to throw it as hard as he can over the plate. Something we talk about with our athletes, we put them through a personality profile, essentially a number of questions where we figure out what type of headspace do you have to be in when you pitch your best. Chase Burns can almost guarantee you he would be maxed out on that assessment for the aggressive and the amped up personality dimensions on that. Seeing the amount of energy intensity that he brings, I just personally love watching guys that have that type of passion. It's me versus the hitter, who's going to win? But again, I use the classic example of Corey Kluber, much more calm, reserved, kind of introverted personality. And so don't think that you have to look like Chase Burns when you pitch. If that works for your personality, it's absolutely worth testing, trialing out, but that might not be you. You might need to be kind of the emotionless, cold-blooded killer, and being able to figure out and over time find out what personality fits your skill set the best. So kind of want to end on this. How good could he be? Well, his raw stuff is as good as anyone. Quite literally, it is off the charts with our pitch models. For college weighted stuff plus, he literally does not show up on the charts for his fastball in some of our charts. I'll show that on the screen right now. However, the same can be said for a lot of top prospects. Well, there's plenty of first rounders who never make it to the big leagues. And so I'm not sitting here trying to hype him up and say that he's a guaranteed Hall of Famer, right? That's absolutely not what I'm saying. I'm just saying stuff-wise with where he's at right now, it compares favorably to other top performers, but there's a long ways between having good stuff for a couple years and being able to do that under pressure and being able to do that for a long time. So for him, it's going to be developing and continuing to refine his pitchability, and it's going to be the longevity piece. It's can he stay healthy for a decade, 15 years, 20 years? And that's ultimately going to determine the type of career that he has. Can he do it when the lights come on under pressure? And so again, I'm rooting for him. I love watching him pitch. I'm excited to see what he can do. If I was him, and maybe he'll watch this video, I'd be seeking out and sending messages to guys like Verlander, Spencer Strider, Garrett Cole, guys who profile similarly, who've had success at the big leagues for years, and picking their brain, trying to understand their mental approach, their strategic approach, what they wish they knew when they were his age. Seek advice from those guys. And just being cautious with over-tinkering with what's working. He's at a point right now where his stuff is as good as ever and as good as anyone, recognizing that there's going to be a lot of coaches in pro ball that are going to want to put their stamp, that are going to suggest changes, approaching those with an open mind, but not getting away from what's worked for him and still kind of filtering that through his own mind and what makes sense and not over-tinkering, because we've seen so many examples of promising guys that they get away from what worked for them and what got them to that point in the first place. So again, rooting for him. Hopefully you guys got something out of this video. Let me know who you'd like to see me break down next. Thanks again, guys.